Here's a piece of me to chew on.
Hey everyone. So last episode we started talking about cannabis and we left off in courage, talking about what is courage and why would that matter and why would that be important. Well, we do need courage in our lives in order to be able to take the necessary intellectual and emotional leap that is stepping outside of our egos. Now, why do we need to step outside of our egos? We need to step outside of our egos in order to learn. It's an intrinsic necessity. In order to learn, you have to remove yourself from your ego, or you're only going to be looking for information to assure your own needs. You're not really looking for communication and participation and mutuality while you're still in your ego. So how do you do that? How do you learn to step out of your own ego? There's a great deal of techniques to do this. I've spoken of meditation, and in other episodes of this thing, I'll be talking about some of the esoteric traditions that also go into this. Today we live in a society that downvalues psychology. And this is a big mistake, because psychology is the one discipline, more than anything together with philosophy, that takes the position that we can learn to observe the inner of being human. And one of the models that I used with my kids when they were small was the thought bubble. You know, I had this, we would play, and I would give them this perceptual idea, this thought, that imagine that in your hand you have a bubble, and it's an imaginary bubble, and you can kind of lift it up and you can manipulate it in size all you want, like a mind trick. It's a little game. Can you do that? And if you can do that, then you can begin to understand how you can reach your ego and how you can step outside of your ego. Now, in this perceptual ball, in this you can imagine yourself, and you can imagine, initially you can imagine yourself as the center. The ego likes that. The ego loves that. And then you can start looking at the reality that you're in. You can start placing things in this bubble, and you can create a world of understanding. As you do this, you grow better and better at being able to move within this perceptual bubble, because everything really is a bubble. So you can move from over here to over here, or over here or over here. And this is not a two-dimensional step. These are not, two-dimensional movements. These are four-dimensional motions, not even three-dimensional, because you're going between conceptual realities, parts of what you are and what everything is. This is something called abstract intelligence. And it's something that's very, very important if you want to learn how to stop controlling others based in fear. This is necessary if we're going to build a progressive, democratic, humanistic society. We need to learn to not base everything in our fears, in our ego. Because the ego is just an interface. The ego is a creation of the very, very small child, of need, of scarcity, of lacking. So the construct that we are, the psychological and the spiritual construct that we are, we find initially all we do is scream. It's that simple. It's that rudimentary. The baby will scream to get what it wants. And when it gets a little bit older, it'll start manipulating. So it'll scream and it'll cry and it will punch and it will break, but it will still just, essentially scream to get what it wants. Now, how do we learn to release ourselves from that? Mostly around, between 3 to 5 years old, most of us kind of learn to start stepping out of that, to start accepting that, well, maybe I can make a concession. Maybe I can accept that if I don't eat all my candy right now, then I'll have more candy later. Or I'll have candy to share. Or I'll have candy that I can sell, you know, depending on what you want. But it's still a way to let go of the ego that is based in the ego. Now, in many of the esoteric traditions, they have something called holy children. Holy children are children who, for one or another reason, are dissociated. They have either, you know, they can be born with this, you know, like a form of autism almost, so they're egoless, or they have become traumatized in one way or another in such a way that they have dissociated from the ego. That's terrible, you know. In some Buddhist rituals, they will put a clock, a bell on top of the head of a child, and they will punch this bell, and it will cause tinnitus. It's terrible, terrible suffering for this young child to constantly be in suffering from, you know, when this child it's a chosen holy child, and it will, you know, go through this terrible traumatizing experience in order to step out of the ego. In the warrior traditions of the European and the American tradition, violence is used in forms of physical violence by physical disciplining, or sexual violence, ritualized fear, and eventually the subject is is brought into a ritual of committing an unspeakable act, whatever that act is, and this act in itself will dissociate the young individual, and in this it offers a way to dissociate from the ego. But these are all superficial versions. These are all reaching that enlightened state in a superficial manner. A great deal of power structures, of the pyramidal hierarchies and sects and little cults are based in this, because they were warriors. They were constructs built in scarcity, and they were looking for that thing that made some people seem happy no matter what the material circumstances was. These people, you know, are truly the happiest people on the planet, and they have something that is the most attainable, the most highest held value of all things. It's acceptance. The traditional feodal approach to letting go of the ego, which is trauma-based dissociation, it's very destructive, because it doesn't create acceptance. It creates indifference. And that's a very, very big difference. Indifference is still like the child who will save his candy to be able to give away candy to get perks. It's based in ego. Because you're still going to have that desire to exist. Because trauma-based enlightenment never really truly lets you take that step back and forth in regards of the ego. On the other hand, we have the esoteric traditions that are not based in violence and trauma. There, we can add to those traditions, we can add modern psychology. Modern psychology is today a continuation of a great deal of these. It's like a cluster and a compositional construct of a great deal of these traditions. Anything from Egyptian mythology to Rosicrucianism or Gnosticism, and in Indian mysticism. We look at people like Jung or Freud to be our guiding personalities, egos in all this. But the truth is, when it comes down to it, striving to step out of the ego, dissociating from the ego, identifying the ego. What is the ego? How can I see it? Well, you can see it by want. You can learn, you can get to know your ego. You can understand what your lower, or shall we say, less sympathetic elements are. That's your ego. There's a lot of people who in the young psychedelic movement, people who glorify DMT and glorify the psychedelic experiences from a psychological perspective. They speak of ego death, a desire to kill the ego, to eradicate the ego. Well, this is not functional. It sounds cool, and if you look at it from a child's perspective, it makes sense, you know, because we see clearly that the ego is the most problematic parts of all our lives. The ego is the source of all our suffering. Well, that's again taking the perspective from the ego's perspective. And the ego believes that it doesn't have enough. The ego believes that it lives in scarcity. The ego does not believe what the earth is because it has not seen the earth. Because the ego only sees exactly what it sees. Like I told you earlier, we live in this perception bubble. We live in this sphere. Now, if you take that sphere and you make that sphere big enough, that sphere will encompass all that you know. Now, if you can move that limits of that sphere, you will eventually have expanded this sphere to the world as we know it. That means that you can no longer have an egotistical view because you've expanded your ego to a point where it's eradicated itself. It's not gone, it's still there, but it has encompassed enough knowledge to understand that it is not, in fact, alone. So basically, the purpose is not to kill the ego. The purpose is to help your ego become functional. Because the ego is just an interface. It is really just a tool for you as a being to participate and deal with the physical, material reality that this is. And don't go after killing your ego. It's better to learn how to deal with your ego. I guess that's today's episode. Take care and write little comments and like us and share and tell people that about this pod, I guess. Take care, everyone. Alak Baba Sirishan Dirak.
'Cause you are